We definitely want off mute. Where we left last week was in chapter 8, verse 22, where Jesus is going to heal the blind man. And one of the things I left you with was to see that this is connected to what's been going on, because what has happened is Jesus he feeds the 4,000 at the beginning of chapter 8, and then the Pharisees approach Jesus. There's this confrontation after this great miracle, and so the Pharisees approach Jesus demanding a sign, and what Jesus says that this generation seeks a sign. I say to you, no sign's going to be given to you. And he left, got in the boat, and went to the other side. And then as they're in the boat, he's teaching his disciples, as he has this loaf of bread, it seems, teaching them about the influence of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod, the leaven of the Pharisees, the leaven of Herod, talking about the influence of the religious leaders of the day. And he says, beware of that. And then immediately the disciples begin to discuss, we have no bread. So their mind is on the earthly. Their mind is on the things of the world. He's trying to teach them a spiritual lesson. He's trying to teach them some very significant things, because he's not going to be with them very long. And so he's trying to teach them these significant lessons, and they don't have a clue, because as he's trying to teach them about the influence of the Pharisees, of the religious leaders of the day, both those that would be the conservative ones, those that might be the most liberal of the group, of the leaders of the Jews. And so they begin to talk about where we're going to get some bread, what are we going to eat. And so then Jesus confronts them with, why are you now discussing the fact that you have no bread? Then he talks about they perceive, but they don't understand. They don't perceive or understand. They have eyes, but they don't see. Ears, but they don't hear. So he confronts them with that. That's toward the end of this section of Jesus' interaction with the disciples. They're in the boat, and so he says to them, don't you remember how I broke the bread and how many basketfuls of the leftovers there were, and 7 for the 4,000. And then he ends it all by saying, do you not understand? Okay, I think that's a very key ending to this section, because what's going to happen next is he's going to heal the blind man, and that's verses 22 through 26. And here is, I think, Jesus making some application about, you have eyes, but you don't see. Because in this miracle of the healing of the blind man, there's something different going to take place. And I believe it's different for this very reason. Jesus is trying to make a point. He's trying to make a point with his miracles, and so the different parts of a miracle obviously are going to be Jesus making a point. So what happens is Jesus heals this blind man partially and then fully. So let's just look at it, and we'll see how it plays out, verses 22 through 26. And this is the miracle of the healing of the blind man at Bethsaida. And they came to Bethsaida, and some people brought to him a blind man and begged him to touch him. And he took the blind man by the hand and led him out of the village. And when he had spit on his eyes and laid his hands on him, he asked him, do you see anything? And he looked up and said, I see people, but they look like trees walking. Then Jesus laid his hands on his eyes again, and he opened his eyes, and his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. And he sent him home, saying, do not even enter the village. So what's happened up to this time, you've got those like the Pharisees, the Herodians, the Sadducees, the religious leaders that were the most influential among the people in that day, and they are blind. We would know that Jesus looks at them and he says, you're blind. He looks at his disciples and tells them, you have eyes, but you do not see. No mistake, I think, that there's this connection with the blindness, and then he says to his disciples, you have eyes, but you don't see. And this follows, they're wondering about where's the bread going to come from. We're hungry, we don't have any bread. So this follows that. His chastisement of them follows their earthly concern as he's trying to teach them the spiritual lesson. And he says, you have eyes, but you don't see. No mistake that the next miracle is going to be this blind man. So what happens with this blind man is that Jesus didn't fail in his attempt to heal. He was doing exactly what he wanted to do. It's not as if the first time it didn't take, and so he's got to do it over, or he's got to do something different. So what happens here is that he spits on his eyes, he lays his hand on him, and Jesus asks this important question, do you see anything? And in answer to that, the blind man says, I see people, but I don't see them clearly. He says they look like trees are walking or something like that. And Jesus then lays his hands on his eyes again. And the next thing that happens, notice verse 25, he says, and he opened his eyes, and his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. Is it a mistake, or is it a coincidence that Mark records, and he saw everything clearly? He just told the disciples, you have eyes, but you don't see. You're seeing, but it's not clear, right? You're seeing, but it's not clear. So I think that the point that Jesus is making with this man is that there are some who see clearly. There are some who see dimly, a lack of understanding. And there are some who are completely blind when it comes to spiritual ideas. And here Jesus, I think, gives the example of all of those as he deals with this blind man, because the man is blind, he cannot see, then he can see but not clearly, and then he can see perfectly. Jesus is trying to move people who are blind to be able to see clearly. People who are seeing dimly or seeing unclear, he's trying to move them to be able to see everything perfectly clear. Now, comments or any observations you'd like to make? This story of that Mark records of the healing of the blind man here, I think the application, we could go on with some of that application, but any ideas or thoughts that you'd like to add? Isn't it interesting that it's even in today's religious world, and even in dealing with people today, isn't it true that we fall into those categories? Either we are unbelievers, we just completely deny Christ, we deny He is who He claims to be, we are against Him, we oppose Him. And when I say we, I'm just talking about those in the world that we live in our society. So we would be considered by Jesus as being blind, like the Pharisees. Then there are those who like the disciples are struggling. They're seeing some things. They're aware of some things. As a matter of fact, the next thing that's going to happen is Jesus is going to ask them, "Who do men say that I am, and who do you say that I am?" So the question then, Peter jumps on that very quickly, and he answers it correctly. But obviously, the thing that's just happened with them in the boat, they're still seeing things unclearly. And he's trying to move these disciples to the point where they, like this blind man, see perfectly clear, where they see everything the way that it should be seen.
They see things that those that are 25 don't see yet because of the experience.
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes I think to see clearly, we have to go through those things, and we come out on the other end and we think, you know what, that didn't work. So now we see clearly.
Mm-hmm. Well, and Barry's comment is that sometimes age, experience, wisdom, all of those kind of things add to the fact that we are able then to see more clearly. And I think sometimes it's very much like maybe a job that we have. One of the things that we do sometimes if you're working a job, whether it's maintenance or putting something together or if it's teaching school, you learn a lot of things by the mistakes you make. You learn a lot of things from other people who you go to their seminar or you read their book or something like that. You read that and you grow. And sometimes a 25-year-old can grow faster and with great acceleration more than someone who did up to their 70s, maybe because they take advantage of all those things that are available. The disciples are walking with Jesus. Is there any better training ground for them to grow very quickly into an understanding and being able to see, because they're with him every day? Some of those people that are following Jesus, they're going to turn and leave. They're going to go back home. They're going back to work. So they're not going to follow him for days and weeks and months and years. But the disciples have that great advantage. Yes, Jamie?
Saw it now, but this little 8-year-old boy was looking up at the clouds and the sky and said, "Look how beautiful the bottom half of heaven is."
How about that?
I can't wait to see what the other side looks like. I've never even thought about it like that.
Right. Out of the mind of children, sometimes out of the mouth of children, yes, sometimes that wisdom, very simple wisdom. Yeah. Yeah.
I believe the way you explained it, it brings it out a whole lot more.
I hope I'm right. That's what I was about to ask. You think I'm on target, or am I totally off? Yes. Am I totally off target?
We've been living so many years with false doctrine, and it's been imbued in us for so long that when the truth finally does show up, it's hard to accept it sometimes. And these guys have been in Judaism for all their life, and all of a sudden they're being taught a new gospel, good news. It's hard for them to understand. So I can see where sometimes it doesn't come clearly. It's like looking in that glass, looking in that mirror and not seeing it darkly.
Yeah.
But it was also one they'd been waiting on for thousands of years.
Exactly, and that's part of, and what John says is part of the issue too, is that from this Jewish background that they have, they're looking for a different kind of Messiah. They're looking for a different kind of Christ. So when Peter proclaims that Jesus is the Christ, in verse 29, when he proclaims that Jesus is the Christ, sometimes we have to define terms, don't we? Sometimes in our discussion, we're talking about two different things because we haven't defined the terms. Everybody, the topic of conversation tonight is the weather. It's cold, right? Well, to some of you, cold means colder than this. But for some of us, this is cold. So unless we define our terms when it comes to what's being said, and so when Peter answers, "You are the Christ," what's the Christ in Peter's mind? What is that to Peter when he says that? What is accumulated in his mind after all these years of teaching from the Jewish perspective of what the Messiah is going to be like and who that Messiah is going to be? And now Peter answers Jesus by saying, "You are the Christ." And is Peter thinking the Christ who came to die on the cross? I don't think so. Exactly. So, yeah, we're going to take it because, and the reason we know that is their argument as they are on their way to the Last Supper. We're talking about the last night of Jesus' life. Their argument is about who's going to be the greatest in the kingdom. I'm going to be vice president. I'm going to be really important. I'm going to be in charge of the military. Sorry, no military, no swords, no army, none of that. So you see, the term that he uses is the right term. But what did he mean by that? What did he mean by that statement? Okay, well, we'll move from the blind man or the healing of the blind man unless you have other comments. But I think none of this is a mistake. Mark puts it all in there, and it seems to flow really well together to me as I think about what's been taking place and the dullness of understanding of the disciples and the way that he deals with the religious leaders of that day and how they are blind and how he talks to the disciples about them being blind. You have eyes but you can't see. And then he heals a blind man. I think it's on purpose for that reason. So look at the next one. The next really paragraph is verses 27 and following. It really goes all the way through chapter 9, verse 1, because really all of this goes together because when Jesus went on with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi, and on the way he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And they told him, "John the Baptist, others say Elijah, others one of the prophets." And he asked him, "But who do you say that I am?" Peter answered him, "You are the Christ." And he strictly charged them to tell no one about him. The short little interaction that he has on their way to Caesarea Philippi is very straightforward. He asks two questions. Who do people say that I am? The same question could be asked today. When you look out in the world, there are people who view Jesus in a lot of different ways. Again, defining your terms. Because if you ask someone, "Do you believe in Jesus?" and they say yes, you need to know what kind of Jesus they believe in. Is it the Son of God, the Savior of the world, or is it a good man, a great prophet, a spokesman, a great preacher, a great teacher? Was he a historical figure who actually lived and was a very solid citizen and did a lot of good deeds? If that's all you see him as, then that doesn't line up with the question I asked. Do you believe in Jesus Christ? Do you believe that Christ existed? Well, yeah, I do. Well, do you believe he's the Son of God? Do you believe he's the Savior of the world? Do you believe he died for the sins of the whole world? Do you believe he came to seek and save the lost and did that by dying on the cross? Oh, no. Goodness, no. That's silly. Well, you see, you've got to define, what do you mean by Christ? What do you mean by that? What are you talking about? So you may think that just in a casual conversation you found a good believer in Jesus, when actually they're an infidel and they believe Jesus was a good man. a good teacher, did some good things, but he wasn't God. So, who do people say I am? That's a good question. He's a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And that's what the answer from the disciples is. They told him, some think you are John the Baptist, some think you are Elijah, some think you are a prophet, one of the prophets, he says. A very general, I think, cross-section of what some might believe. That Jesus is a prophet, that Jesus is one that has been blessed by God to be able to do miraculous things, that he is actually a reincarnation of a great leader and a man who had a great message, a man who tried to bring the people back to God and change their hearts to bring them back to God, would have been John the Baptizer. A lot of good things there, but in none of those is there a statement that says the people believed he was God in the flesh and the Savior of the world. So Jesus goes on. So who do you say that I am? I know who the world says I am. I know who the people talk about me as being. But who do you say that I am? Peter answers. Is he speaking for all of the apostles? Is he speaking for just Peter? We really don't know exactly what Peter is representing here. So the best I can do to interpret what's happening here is that Peter's speaking for himself. And he says, you are the Christ. Again, what does Peter mean by that? What does he mean by Christ? Does it have the elements that we understand today when we say that word Christ? Did Peter understand he was the Son of God, the Savior of the world, and would soon die on the cross? I don't think so. Yeah, Randy. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, and again, I think this really highlights what I've been saying, and that is the disciples are still seeing dimly. They're still seeing people, but they look like trees. They see Jesus. They have an understanding that there's something great going on here, and this is world changing, but they just can't quite wrap their brain around everything that's going on here yet, quite yet. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It is a good point, and Ryan echoes, I think, a lot what John was saying a while ago, which is when you've been taught this from a little child, it is difficult to break free from that, even as you hear the truth. It takes some time for that to kind of to soak, and that's what's going on here. That's why Jesus keeps telling them and keeps teaching them and keeps working with them and he doesn't throw them back in the Galilee Sea and go find more. That. Mm-hmm. Yeah. My time has not yet come. He doesn't say that, but that's why he says, don't tell anybody, because as soon as that gets to be a popular understanding, yep, yep, good point. So what's going to happen next is that Jesus is going to teach them a hard teaching. He's tried to open their eyes. He's tried to give them a little bit of understanding. Let me remind you who I am. If I am, or since I am the Christ, let me tell you what that means. Okay, we're going to define the term. What does it mean for you, Peter, to say, I am the Christ? Now notice, nowhere in here does he talk about sitting on the throne or getting up an army or gathering swords or overthrowing the Roman government. As a matter of fact, it's the opposite. Notice what happens. Verse 31 beginning. And he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. That was a gut punch right there. I mean, if you stopped right there, that's a gut punch to them, because he tells them straight out, here is the kind of Christ I am. What do you tell them? I'll be rejected, I'll be killed, and after 3 days rise again. Oh, I will suffer and be rejected and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. That's what he said, and that's just one verse. Verse 32. And he said this plainly. Is there any way you could misunderstand what he said in verse 31? I'm going to be mistreated. I'll be abused. I'm going to be killed, but I will resurrect after 3 days. No way you can misunderstand that. He did, yes. Yeah. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. The statement is to all those that can hear. It is not directed only at a select few. And he said this plainly, verse 32. Now, Peter is offended by this. So Peter calls Jesus aside, and he began to rebuke him. One thing I can say about you, Peter, you got guts. Yeah. Yeah, yeah. So what Peter does here, by pulling Jesus aside, and I don't know exactly the words, but from my perspective, and as I read this, and Peter begins to rebuke him, it would be something like, you can't say that. You just can't say that. You say that, everybody's going to leave. You're going to lose all your followers. You just can't. You can't say that out loud. Yeah. Yeah. It's this shock thing that's happened, and Peter responds with, no, you can't do that. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, yeah. So as Peter rebukes Jesus, then Jesus turns and looks at the disciples. As Maury says, the setting is probably something like as they're on the move and Jesus is teaching as he walks, maybe. But the idea seems to be that Peter is going to lead him down this road that Jesus is not going to go on. So he says, "Get behind me, Satan. You're not going to lead this. You're not going to guide this. You're not going to determine the way that this moves." So look at verse 33. "But turning and seeing his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, 'Get behind me, Satan, for you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man.'" I've got that verse circled, and I got an arrow that I can't point it all the way over, but all the way over here to chapter 8, when they're in the boat, when Jesus is talking to them about spiritual things, and the first thing that happens is they begin to wonder what they're going to eat. So what his accusation of Peter is, you are not thinking about the things of God, you are thinking like a man. You're thinking about things from human wisdom. You're looking at things from that perspective of being human. You're not putting your mind or setting your mind on the things of God. So Peter rebukes Jesus. You can't do that. You can't say that. That can't be the way this plays out. Jesus says, "Get behind me, Satan. Your thinking is that of a man whose mind is on the things of man and not on the things of God." So you're not leading this parade. You're not going to guide the way that this goes. So get behind me. Mm-hmm. Right. It's not going to happen the way you want it to happen or the way you think it ought to happen. It's going to happen the way God said it was going. Mm-hmm. Exactly. Yeah. Very same mistake that the Jews made in the first century, people are making today by saying that this is truly the way God would want it to turn out, when God said, this is not how it's going to turn out. I've already got my plan laid out. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And that he demonstrates that attitude in another place. Actually, I'll die with you. That kind of attitude where he believes that this is going to be a fighting thing. We're going to fight this thing out. Instead of it ending this way, it can't end this way, Peter thinks. But that's God's plan. That's the way God has made it out. So Peter's downfall here is, as Jesus describes it, you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but you are setting your mind on the things of men. You have human concerns. You're not thinking about God's concerns. Your mind is on human interest. Your mind is on the material. Your mind is on that which is opposed to God and His plan. You're looking at things from a human point of view. You're not looking at things from God's point of view. And so Jesus straightens him out pretty quickly. And that statement, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man." I think that because of the median age of the first century Jewish race and pretty much everybody, the lifespan was not very long anyway. So I'm not sure age had as much to do with it as his lineage. One of the things is that the prophet can't come from Galilee. That's across the tracks. That's the poor side of town. That's where the people who are uneducated live. And remember that the people knew, and you can't leave this behind, I don't think, that the people knew that there was something that was going on with Mary and Joseph and this birth of this child and everything that was going on there. And many may have looked at him as being illegitimate, or maybe conceived out of wedlock, at least from that perspective. So I think he just didn't fit the bill. Yeah, he just didn't fit what they. I mean, he needs to come from a kingly source. He needs to come from within the religious leaders of the day, or something of that nature. Whatever you think about from the first century of being somebody that's important, or would be able to handle. I mean, think about it. Jesus had no formal training. He didn't follow a rabbi. None of that. So he wasn't qualified in any way from their perspective. Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah, as we mentioned before, his time hasn't come, and if all of this really begins to collect, it can get out of hand very quickly. Mike's point being the close relationship between the Old Testament word Messiah and this New Testament word the Christ. Very similar in nature. They're looking from that Old Testament perspective of the Messiah who would deliver them. They're looking for one who would deliver. So that defines very clearly, I think, what their complication is. He doesn't fit that bill of being one who's able to deliver. Yes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Good point. Okay, we'll pick up there next week, and what we're about to get into now is from after his confrontation with Peter, and some more explanation about what his messiahship will be like.